So as I said before, the issue is, can we meaningfully distinguish fearful temperament from anxiety disorder? Are they basically the same underlying construct? Now, in doing that, I should have mentioned at the beginning, I was joined recently at my university, Macquarie University, by Rob Copeland, who many of you would know or know of, who's one of Ken Rubin's ex-students and is a developmental psychologist. And then he came by, he's down in Australia. Oh, he's in Australia, I shouldn't say down, that's terrible. He's in Australia on sabbatical, and he came by for a couple of weeks to our university. And he and I started talking about this, and so I've got him involved in the chapter that we're writing for the book, and I've got him, as a result, a lot of his ideas are also involved in this talk. I know there was a point at why I talked about Rob being involved. Anyway, Rob's involved in this and has given me a good sort of developmental direction for this. Oh, that's right, what it was. In discussing with Rob, we came up with what we thought of as a series of hypotheses to say, well, if disorder and temperament are separate constructs, we would perhaps make a number of predictions about what we should see in the two. And so we can test the hypotheses, being good scientists, we can go and test the hypotheses by looking at the literature and seeing what evidence we can come up to say, well, are they really different or are they not different? So that's the way I've constructed the talk. I'm going to talk about the hypotheses that we've come up with and then have a look at whether there's evidence to support those hypotheses or not. Well, these are my kids, and they're on there's this great set of salt flats down the bottom of down the bottom southern part of Australia, around just outside Adelaide in South Australia, and these magnificent pink, you can't really see very well here, but sort of pink-hued salt flats, which look absolutely magnificent. Yeah. Okay, so first hypothesis. First of all, just purely descriptively, if inhibition, if sort of temperament, disorder are separate things, you should expect that you should be able to identify certain features, certain descriptive aspects of the two that are different. So you should be able to find aspects of shyness, inhibition, fearful type temperaments that are different to anxiety disorders, and vice versa, aspects of anxiety disorders that you don't find in temperament. And my assumption in looking at this was that we wouldn't find this at all. I was quite surprised that we did find some differences. The top three, is there a pointy thing? Anyway, the top three measures there are some of the sort of common questionnaire measures of temperament. And then the next four are some of the common measures of childhood anxiety. In looking, so what we did was just, Rob and I just sat down and looked at some of the items and just sort of tried to make a rough guess about, would you find this sort of item in the opposite measure? So from a temperament measure, would you find this sort of item also in a disorder measure or not? And there are a number of items which we thought were pretty common. You can see some there: shy about meeting new children, talkative with adult strangers, shy with strange adults from the temperament scale, shy with new children. I would expect to find those equally much in a measure of social phobia and clinical type measure. From the clinical perspective, afraid if I have to talk in front of class, shy and quiet around new people, upset if something unexpected happens, I would expect to find them just as much in a temperament measure. So there are items in temperament measures and items in anxiety disorder measures that would be in both, and they're pretty common. But there was also, surprisingly, quite a number of unique items which I wouldn't have expected to find in the other, and that we didn't find across them, and that surprised me. And so from the temperament measures, there were things like being very cautious, that sort of idea of cautiousness, being uncomfortable across situations, very broad sort of general reticence type measures, which you tend not to find in disorder questionnaires so much. And in the disorders, there were items particularly about very specific fears of particular objects and situations, which you tend typically not to find in most temperament measures. And the other things that you find in the disorder measures are cognitive types of items, worries in particular. A lot of the items in disorder measures are worry types of items, which you tend not to find in temperament measures, and also physiological symptoms. So there are clearly differences in the way the constructs are talked about. Now, this doesn't mean that they're necessarily different constructs, though. What you tend to find is that temperament is measured typically in very young children, and it's measured by parents. It's usually measured by asking parents, disorder is typically focused on by looking at in slightly older children and asking self-report. And so it's not surprising then that disorder measures focus perhaps more on internal sorts of things, like worries, like physical symptoms. Temperament measures tend to focus more on behaviours. Temperament is also defined in a more trait-like fashion, or thought about in a more cross-situational trait-like fashion. So having items that are more broad and general is less surprising, whereas disorder is typically conceptualised in a more state-like fashion. They may still be the same construct, but just focused on in state versus trait or internal versus external focus. So yes, it's true, they do tend to have different types of items that tap into them, different descriptors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're fundamentally different constructs. It may, but it may not. Okay, that's a summary of what I just said. There's little overlap. Yeah, as I said, measures of anxiety disorders typically cognitive, physical symptoms, specific fears. Temperament measures are more general sorts of items, more about restriction and general cautiousness. Interestingly, the common items are very much ones that we're associated with, that we're interested here in this symposium. The common items tend to be very much social. So social phobia and shyness, of all the anxiety disorders, of all the temperament types, social phobia and shyness are probably the most closely connected, because they were the ones that are particularly common. Okay, so as I said, it could just be that they're reflecting maturational factors, that you tend to find earlier features in temperament, later features in disorder, and it may reflect reported differences, that you find self-report more for temperament, for disorder, and other report for temperament. Okay. Related to that sort of idea, another hypothesis is that you should also then find somewhat lowish or modest correlations between the constructs. If they're different constructs, then the measures should not correlate perfectly. They should correlate considerably less than perfectly. I won't say how much, but they should correlate less. When you look at the correlations, you tend to find that's reasonably true. So there's one study, just an example, one of Rob's studies looking at preschool children. They found a fairly low correlation. However, in that particular study, they used different reporters. So they had parents reporting on shyness, teachers reporting on anxiety symptoms, and we know that cross-informant correlations are poor. So that doesn't necessarily mean much. The next three, though, did use the same reporters. So the next four actually used the same reporters. So in Copeland et al. And Press, you had mothers reporting on behavioural inhibition and anxiety symptoms. In Peter Muris's research, they looked at slightly older kids, looking at behavioural inhibition, questionnaire report, and internalising symptoms. And in Lonergan's work, they looked at a whole broad range of kids, and looking at broad and negative affectivity and anxiety symptoms. And in all cases, the correlations are around about 0.5, 0.6. So we're still talking really 30–40% of the variance being common. That may well be a reflection of measurement error, but it's a big amount of measurement error. So one would hope that the measures are not that poor, that it seems that they really are perhaps not tapping in on exactly the same construct. And finally, in the study by Lemery et al., this was a very nicely done study, because they actually went through and got independent raters to look at the two measures, their measures of fearful temperament and anxiety symptoms, and actually remove the items that were common. And once they removed the items that were common, they found that the correlation in fact dropped quite dramatically, and so you could identify different sets of items that correlated actually quite minimally, and so suggesting that they really, you maybe are tapping in on somewhat different constructs. On a related sort of notion of the idea of less than unity correlations, sort of on a more individualised or categorical perspective, you should be able to find, if temperament and disorder are different, you should be able to identify people who score high on temperament but do not meet criteria for disorder, and vice versa. So at a categorical level, you should be able to identify people who are different for the two.